Now, I've known Doug for over 30 years. He has been ubiquitous at every book fair, ephemera fair, all over the United Kingdom and the United States. He's put together one incredible collection of Arctic material. He's a published writer. He's done biographies on Isaac Hayes. And the other guy I actually didn't know, it's Frederick Schwartek. Anyway, Doug, you're going to have to explain this. And now a retired attorney. So he's got more time to come to ephemera fairs normally and buy more material for his collection. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what he's pulled out of this massive array and what story he's going to tell us today about the Arctic. But you couldn't have a better person telling you. So Doug, if you're there, because I'm looking at your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much, David, for that generous introduction. And you did actually get Frederick Schwatka's name pretty much correct. He was another 19th century American polar explorer. So I just have a biography of him coming out as we speak. In any event, this morning I'd like to discuss ephemera in the dawn of luxury travel to the Arctic regions. That may sound like an oxymoron, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, excursions to the forbidding north were no longer solely the province of the grizzled explorer and rugged whaleman. Men, women, and children, young and old, embarked on voyages to the Arctic and even rubbed shoulders with those adventurers. Their trips earned them a Gilded Age merit badge of sorts. Their excursions and the extensive memorabilia surrounding those trips are ephemeral pieces that have been preserved in history and tell a story. They also left an indelible impression not only on the passengers, but also the recipients of those ephemeral pieces, and have served to shape their and our own perceptions of the Arctic regions. By way of background, in the mid-19th century, the Victorian traveler seeking a different and more exotic locale found the island of Iceland as a destination that was rather accessible and not too trying on the constitution. Touted as the land of fire and ice, the volcanic island held a sort of sublime appeal with spouting geysers, hot springs, and boiling cauldrons. A strenuous but not so difficult trek up 5,000-foot Mount Hecla, still an active volcano, was a tantalizing adventure. This is a contemporary engraving of the forbidding Mount Hecla. Its frequent eruptions gained it the name of the Gateway to Hell, and it was feared as a gathering place for witches. But Victorian travelers were opening up the north beyond Iceland. In 1856, the Marquis of Dufferin, later Governor General of Canada, touched the island of Spitsbergen, 400 miles north of the coast of Norway, in his private yacht, the Foam. Dufferin's lively narrative, Letters from High Latitudes, presented a lively, almost comically easy description of the voyage. It served as inspiration for many armchair explorers. Other wealthy Victorians soon followed in search of adventure and hunting, such as James Lamont and Benjamin Lee Smith. This is an engraving from Lamont's book, Yachting in the Arctic Seas, another title that promoted the idea of safe seafaring in the North by pleasure craft. You can see the obvious attraction for sport hunting. It's a rather wild setting, but not overly taxing for the refined and exceedingly well-dressed sportsman, as we can see from this image. But the North was no longer limited to the peripatetic wealthy adventurer. One of those armchair adventurers to follow was the talented artist William Bradford. In 1869, the American Bradford was seized by an uncontrollable desire to study nature under what he called the terrible aspects of the frozen zone. With professional photographers, he set out to Arctic Greenland to capture images by camera to be used as the basis for his paintings. Bradford was by no means wealthy, and to partially pay the hefty cost of his expedition, he struck upon the novel idea of advertising for fare-paying passengers. Here's a copy of a rather unpretentious ephemeral flyer by Bradford, touting the marvels of the excursion. Bradford highlights the opportunity to literally follow in the track of real Arctic explorers on a cruise in which the dangers will be trifle. I include it as a contrast to the later, more polished marketing brochures that we'll see. Notice that Bradford left to the last line the stiff $1,000 fee for this privilege, about $22,000 in today's money. Not surprisingly, no more than a handful of passengers stepped up to pay, if that many. However, the wealthy banker and patron of Bradford's art, LeGrand Lockwood, offered to pay the entire cost of outfitting the expedition. Unfortunately for Bradford, while he was plying the icebergs of Greenland, a financial panic swept the United States, leaving his financier Lockwood bankrupt and unable to pay for the voyage. Bradford took on the responsibility and, to his credit, fully satisfied the debt. The trip provided Bradford with subject matter for some of his best-selling art. And Bradford also produced a monumental elephant folio book of photographs of the adventure entitled The Arctic Regions, 350 copies of which were available by subscription. Here is a prospectus for the Arctic regions. Notable subscribers included Her Majesty the Queen, the Duke of Argyll, and even the amateur adventurer Lord Dufferin. Bradford's Arctic paintings are well known, and he did much to bring the magnificence and sublime images of the Arctic regions to the public. But few people knew Bradford was bitten by the Arctic bug. He became enamored by the Arctic and a prolific lecturer describing its features and even its history. Here's an advertising brochure for his formal recital, a series of lectures displaying photographs from his own Arctic voyages and other notable expeditions. This is the Sermitsialak Glacier of Greenland, included as a double-page foldout in his book, The Arctic Regions. But here's another lecture brochure of Bradford's, highlighting 7 expeditions to the north. Bradford's paintings, photographs, and lecture activities helped bring the wonders of the Arctic to the public. Others followed Bradford's approach. The enthusiastic and budding explorer, Dr. Frederick Cook, who would later claim to have reached the North Pole, was stifled on his plans to raise enough funds for an initial expedition to Greenland. Still desirous to travel to Greenland, but unable to pay for a charter himself, he advertised for passengers for a charter voyage. Here's Cook's slightly more flashy advertisement, highlighting Greenland's icy mountains. Whether the ad was also intentionally tinted green in light of the Greenland voyage, or simply just faded, is unclear. Cook was evidently a better salesman than Bradford. He managed to solicit a total of some 50 fare-paying passengers at about $500 each, largely wealthy New Yorkers, sportsmen, and a few college students sent by their parents. However, misfortune befell the voyage. His ill-fated ship, the Miranda, struck a reef and slowly sank off the coast of Greenland. The passengers returned safely in a fishing schooner, sharing an uncomfortable return with a ton of codfish. A quick ephemeral aside, the friendships formed on Cook's voyage on the Miranda led its so-called survivors to form a club they called the Arctic Club of America. They would meet annually to regale the voyage over cigars and more regularly for lectures. This is a copy of the ephemeral bulletin that was produced by the club, detailing its members' activities. The creator, though, took some artistic license with the inclusion of Antarctic penguins on the right. However, over time, the club expanded its membership to include polar explorers from both poles, and ultimately, the club served as the inspiration for the Explorers Club of New York City that we know today. But Bradford and Cook represented small-time organized excursions to the north. Big business in the form of cruise line companies saw a potential financial opportunity and dipped a toe in the water, or rather, I should say, in the ice water. Rather than sit idle, cruise ships that had, in winter, gallivanted the posh locales of the Mediterranean, the French Riviera, or even the Orient, realized that those ships could be made use of to go north in the summer. In the early 1880s, the first regular steamship communication opened up to the island of Spitsbergen, north of the European continent. Here's a map of Spitsbergen, which actually the Svalbard archipelago. You can see here, Spitsbergen is the largest island in the archipelago and the destination for most of the cruise ships. By contrast, here's Iceland, actually below the Arctic Circle, and Greenland on the left. Spitsbergen is icebound, except for a brief window during 2 summer months when the temperature could be quite comfortable. Ships could voyage in relative safety along the island's western coast, touring magnificent deep fjords, viewing spectacular glaciers and ice-rimmed mountains, as well as viewing distinctive wildlife, such as the polar bear, walrus, and myriad bird life, all under the proverbial midnight sun. It was truly a 19th century version of what we would today call ecotourism. Spitsbergen had been a scene of active whaling as carried on as early as the 16th century, but with whale stocks largely depleted, the archipelago became the domain of the explorer, trapper, and miner until the late 1800s. By that time, regular excursionists were tiring of the fjords of Norway, stunning as they were. The first steamer taking tourists to Spitsbergen arrived in the summer of 1881. Far from a success, pack ice and foul weather cut short the visit to the island, and the 60 passengers who believed they hadn't received their money's worth complained of a Spitsbergen swindle. Certainly, it was far from a promising start, nor a harbinger of the future, but commercial success slowly emerged over the next decade. This is a marketing brochure for the pioneering voyage of the Lusitania by the Orient Steam Navigation Company in 1894. An unfortunate name, as it was not the same Lusitania of the Cunard Line that was torpedoed and sunk with great loss of life in 1915. With an economically rising middle class in Europe and America, with leisure time, cruise lines could fill larger ships. These were not the mega ships or love boats of today. The Orient steamer ferried 60 fare-paying tourists on its maiden Arctic voyage. From their start, the travel brochures played to the magnificent views. Here, a glacial fjord. With modest success, a spirited competition among several steam lines would make Spitsbergen cruising take off. Here's a colorful brochure advertising for the Norwegian steamship Lofoten in 1896, showing Spitsbergen and the so-called sports route, which I'll discuss in a moment, highlighting the formidable ice pack extending to the pole and the midnight sun. Clearly, the brochures sought to highlight the exotic aspects of the excursion. Inside the brochure were more images of the rugged and untamed nature of the landscape, the purview of sealers and whalers. This is an image from inside that same brochure. On board ship, however, the tourists found all the comforts of a cruise line, including an elaborate dinner menu featuring a choice of oxtail, roast chicken, or boiled neck of mutton. This is a dinner menu from the 1896 cruise of the Orient Line steamer Garonne. Quick to join the action, the Hamburg American Line had begun to send its own steamer, the Augusta Victoria, with its 44 staterooms, to the land of the midnight sun by 1897. This is the marketing brochure for the Augusta Victoria of the Hamburg American Line. Like the Lofoten, the Augusta Victoria was outfitted for comfort, and according to its brochure, was arranged as to rob traveling of its many petty annoyances and appeal strongly to people of refinement and wealth. Marketing testimonials pushed family-oriented aspect of the vacation or holiday cruise, which subtly dispelled any safety issues plying among the ice floes. Here's a testimonial included with the brochure. My wife and 3 small children will unite with me in saying that this trip was so agreeable, we wish we could do it all over again. Here's another brochure for a dreamy cruise by the Augusta Victoria in 1899, curiously highlighting on the first page the numerous watertight compartments and double-bottomed hull with watertight chambers. P&O was a latecomer, but its accommodations were particularly extravagant with electric lights and hot and cold running water. Here's the P&O brochure. P&O also touted its excursion as the closest to the North Pole. So what were the vacationers doing in Spitsbergen? They probably weren't skinny dipping, but there were a number of attractions. Sightseeing from deck and from land was the most popular activity. That popular late Victorian pastime, shooting as much wildlife as possible, was also a frequent diversion. Spitsbergen has one of the highest concentration of polar bears in the world. It also boasts a sizable population of reindeer, which, as an aside, were hunted almost to extinction in the early 1900s by these avid so-called sportsmen. Certainly, the opportunity to bag big game was a draw for the amateur hunter, and we see many brochures touting the sports or sportsman route. Another activity was climbing, though on a far smaller scale. In the late 1800s, parts of Spitsbergen, particularly the interior, were still unexplored. As passengers set foot on the island in 1896, the British climber Sir Martin Conway was returning from an extensive trip to the interior, removing some of those blank spaces and summiting several mountains. Conway also made the first east to west traverse of the island. His return to continental Europe was made on board the tourist steamer Empress, and passengers were thrilled to chat with the accomplished explorer. This is an ephemeral piece, the prospectus from his book, First Crossing of Greenland, a widely popular publication that stimulated climbing interest in the island. In 1896, it also occurred to the steamship owners that more hardy tourists or hunters might actually want to spend a few days on the island. So lumber was transported to Advent Bay in Spitsbergen, and a rustic hotel of sorts was constructed. Here's an image of the hotel from a marketing brochure. These rough-hewn pine boards housed some 30 persons for as much as a week and had the luxury of a heated lounge, courtesy of a cast iron stove, as well as a piano for entertainment. Another surviving piece of cruise ephemera and marketing ingenuity was the Spitsbergen Gazette, published in 1897. Here's a picture of the front page of one issue of the Spitsbergen Gazette. The Spitsbergen Gazette was touted as the most northern newspaper on the globe. It was actually printed in Hammerfest, Norway, though, by a school teacher, but it was claimed to be edited in the hotel in Spitsbergen, where it was made available. Notice the image of the hotel in the far right corner. Its issues were published in Norwegian, German, and English, reflecting its clientele. It was actually a well-written publication featuring articles on the history of the island, current cruise activities, and of course, heavy marketing. Cruise ships also offered certificates for crossing the Arctic Circle, another merit badge. This one is from later years. You can imagine how young people must have reacted to having received one. The cruise ships didn't employ the more exhilarating practice of tossing a person overboard on their maiden crossing of the Arctic Circle, as some naval ships were prone to do when crossing the equator. But the activity in which everyone participated was writing and sending postcards. These postcards were made available on board ship, as well as at the hotel established on Spitsbergen. It was reported that the various steamship companies produced more than 1,000 different postcards, a remarkable achievement when one considers the limited number of vessels and passengers compared to other more frequented locations. Many passengers sent letters and dutifully recorded entries in diaries in Victorian fashion, but surviving postcards provide perhaps the best glimpse of people, places, and events during the heyday of Spitsberg touring from the late 1890s. They also served as a sort of look at me item within social circles. It was not unusual for passengers to send more than 50 postcards on a voyage, and one voyage reportedly sent more than 20,000 in total. The postcards served another purpose. They were an effective marketing product and virtually cost-free for the cruise lines. They would recoup the modest cost by selling them, but in return, they received widespread publicity. Visually stunning cards that displayed wildlife and natural scenery reached far more persons than marketing brochures and served to pique the interest of the potential passengers. This is another one of the postcards, the magnificent Magdalena Glacier, another prime attraction in Spitsbergen. Well-known landscape artists painted scenes during their visits that would become the basis for some of these postcards. This one shows the graves of the many whalemen who had died on the island during the height of the whaling trade. Notice the number of cruise ships at anchor in the bay. Despite the bright, colorful flora pictured here. Spitsbergen could host some raw, gloomy days, made more melancholy by the partially exposed graves. Not surprisingly, postcards often picture their own cruise ships. This is an image of the Augusta Victoria mentioned before. A post office was opened at the hotel and manned by cruise line staff during the summer season. Stamps were made available and posted at the hotel and made their way into the postal system, bringing news from the top of the world. The postcards also served another purpose. They recorded exploration history in the making. The Brit Sir Martin Conway was just one of several noted explorers who could be found in Spitsbergen. As Spitsbergen tourism increased in the mid-1890s, passengers could literally rub shoulders with explorers departing or returning from the North Pole. Spitsbergen's location, closer to the North Pole than most landmasses, and its relative accessibility by ship made it an ideal launching point for North Pole attempts. In 1896, the Swede Solomon August Andre attempted to reach the North Pole by balloon, starting from Spitsbergen. One of his biggest obstacles was simply finding a suitable launching point that could be reached by ship to deposit his tons of equipment and that could house his balloon. A large structure was built on the island, which held the balloon as it was filled with hydrogen prior to the launch. Here's a postcard memorializing the balloon house. Postcards of Andre's balloon house and his expedition would become a prime attraction for the cruise lines. And the house itself became a prime tourist attraction. By the way, by balloon, I don't mean a rigid motorized dirigible capable of being steered. I meant a true multi-layered silk balloon. Here's a poster commemorating Andre's monumental North Pole attempt. Again, notice the cruise ship juxtaposition near the balloon. Passengers from tourist ships were received by Andre and his two traveling companions as they prepared their attempt. As you can see, the spectators were almost a part of history. They're standing on the shore there. It would be as if spectators to the moon launch could visit Cape Canaveral before the launch and speak to the astronauts as they entered the spacecraft. In the case of Andre's fanciful attempt, however, those passengers likely discussed whether Andre's attempt was a stroke of genius or a colossal folly. His 1896 attempt never got off the ground, but it did in 1897. And in fact, the Pittsburgh Gazette memorialized the balloon launch in 1897. There was an enormous outpouring of ephemera associated with Andre's expedition. Andre actually carried 4 homing pigeons aboard to be released along the flight to bring news to the newspaper Aftonbladet. One of the pigeons was actually shot by a hunter off the coast of Spitsbergen. A note was recovered with news of Andre's expedition shortly after departure, noting at the time all was well. Here's the notice by the Swedish newspaper proudly touting their receipt of the pigeon mail. On the left is the balloon message, and on the right, now stuffed pigeon. But the expedition was unheard of for months. Leaflets were produced and dropped off in Greenland and Spitsbergen, explaining what to do if one was a witness to this UFO-like object. This is one printed piece of ephemera, a flyer picturing the balloon with a note on the reverse advising the recipient what it is and to get help. This one actually is in a Inuktitut. Sadly, Andre and his companions died on a remote location in the eastern Svalbard archipelago. Their bodies were discovered by a sealer in 1930. Cause of death is uncertain, but one theory posits they died of trichinosis from undercooked or raw polar bear meat. But Conway and Andre weren't the only explorers to visit Spitsbergen at the time. Cruise passengers were also on hand to witness the return of Fridtjof Nansen's ship, the Fram, from its North Pole attempt. In 1893, Nansen's ship had intentionally sailed into the ice north of Siberia, attempting to drift to the North Pole. The Fram crossed the polar basin, but failed to reach the pole. The ship was miraculously freed from ice in 1896. More remarkable, however, was the coincidence that the Fram arrived at the location in Spitsbergen where Andre's first polar expedition was preparing to depart. For the cruise ship operators, the publicity could not have been better. Postcards memorialized the event and certainly attracted attention of future tourists to this remote location. This is a widely popular card that shows the hotel together with Andre's balloon launch and the Fram returning to Spitsbergen. Several years later, the American Walter Wellman attempted on several occasions to reach the pole by dirigible from a location near Andre's balloon house. He was likewise unsuccessful, but did not lose his life in the attempt. And this is a postcard memorializing the event. Cruise activities continued until the start of the First World War. Here are several brochures from post-1900. This is one with an image of a polar bear, another frequent marketing feature. Here's one with a fanciful image of a spouting whale, and of course, one with the ubiquitous midnight sun. Though suspended during the First and Second World Wars, tourism to Spitsbergen and even Greenland continued afterwards. To this day, cruise ships still make the trip. Ecotourism has taken off in the last 25 years, with Spitsbergen in particular, a prime destination of great interest on the front of climate change. However, there's something special about those pioneering attempts at tourism in the high Arctic. Thank you.
Can you unshare your desktop now so that we can
Yes.
see you?
Yep. Give me a moment here.
And while he's doing that, the only way he'll be able to hear questions is with the microphone. So if you have questions, raise your hand and Beth will bring the microphone over to you. And you also have to take off the end of the video down at the bottom.
Is that where it says leave?
No, don't hit leave. At the bottom of the screen over on the left, there's a button
Yep.
for the video, and it's got a line through it right now, and you need to click on that, and that'll take the line off.
Okay. Okay. I was having problems with that before because it says Zoom is unable to detect a camera, but I'll try it again.
There you go.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Questions? Comments? Here, Beth. Oh, okay. Do Barbara first. We've got one down here. Let's see if this works.
Hi, Doug. How many Arctic cruises have you been on?
Probably 2. However, I haven't been to Spitsbergen. I did do an icebreaker tour many years ago that went through the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, but actually I've never been to Spitsbergen myself.
And Doug, your camera went off again. If you can get it back.
How's that?
There we go.
Oh,
Yeah, almost.
there we are.
There. Okay. Beth, up front.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering if the people who lived in these Arctic regions that were visited so often ever turn up in the ephemera. Right? These were not vacant lands. There were Eskimos and other people who lived there. Just
Yes, well, I think
curious.
it's a good question. And it depended on the region in which was being visited. So many of the cruises stopped in Lapland in Norway, and they of course would pick up images of the native people in those locations. There were also voyages to Alaska, which picked up ephemeral pieces of Native Americans on the Alaskan side as well. Spitsbergen had no permanent residents, so there were no indigenous peoples pictured in the ephemera there. There were later mining activities and other activities which pictured residents, so-called, at the time. But I think you'd have to look to Greenland, Lapland, and Arctic Alaska for ephemeral pieces that captured native peoples. And they did make their way into the postcards. Again, it was attractive for the cruise lines to show those types of things because it generated interest in their client base to visit, these so-called exotic peoples.
Thank you very much.
Way back. And while Beth's getting there, I'd like to acknowledge Beth Carroll Horrocks, who is on the board and is doing the running today.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Woo! Doug, you have absolutely amazing images. My question is, could you speak a little bit more about the postcard, the steamship postcard connection as it regards advertising? Because I work in department stores and they were certainly doing the same thing, assuming the costs of producing the postcards for the benefit of the advertising. Do you know what companies or any more intel? Thank you.
Sure. Actually, the advertising on the cards came a little bit later. As I saw it, for example, the last card I showed you about the Wellman expedition was 1907, 1908, and even 1919. He'd made 3 or 4 attempts up in the Arctic. And so it was around that time that I noticed the advertising creeping in a little bit more. They tended to be things that you might associate with the North. For example, chocolate bars. Whenever they think of explorers, they're chewing on chocolate bars. So chocolate bars became an attraction, as did some ales. So those types of products which sort of linked themselves with the nature of the trip being rugged and hard, those types of products lent themselves to advertising. I'm not a complete expert on it, but that's hopefully what I can contribute to the question.
Could you tell us something about the collection itself, how it got started and its size and scope?
Sure. My collection of postcards and other memorabilia started probably 25, 30 years ago, probably closer to 30 years. And it was, as David had mentioned, it's literally in the old days, you kind of went to postcards and book fairs and kind of worked your way through booths looking for, through thousands of cards for different things. Some of the images here I have to acknowledge were graciously offered to me by Professor John Riley, who actually wrote a book on Spitsbergen postcards. So it's a very wonderful reference, and he contributed a number of the postcards. But the combination of running around at book fairs, and then over time, once people get to know you, they obviously offer out materials. But my postcard collection is certainly far smaller than my book collection, for example, and probably is 100 to 150 cards, some early, many of them later. So hopefully that answers your question.
Doug, thank you for the presentation. This may be a little outside your collecting scope, but when I think of cruise lines today, I think of them photographing their passengers as they embark and maybe during their activities on board. Have you ever come across any photographs of the passengers on these cruises?
Actually, yes, I'm glad you asked that question. The passengers didn't often make it into the cards that you see. That's typically landscape, animals, natural scenery. Occasionally you'd get a few passengers standing on shore, but those are just generalized images. They're not of particular people. Where I've seen photos, and I actually have a number of them, are in the albums that people would create as they went up. Very often, young people within a family would be sort of the diarist for the expedition. And so they have these wonderful diaries that describe the trip. They have little hand-drawn maps, and many of them include photographs of people, places, and events. And that's where there's a large number of photographs of people, largely in those albums that the people kept as keepsakes.
Did the Russians organize tours to Svalbard and Spitsbergen? I ask because in the 1980s, NATO was worried that the Russians were going to come and take the area. And
I'm not actually familiar with Russian tourism in the 19th century to Spitsbergen. However, one of the things that began in the early 20th century was mining in Spitsbergen. And both the Norwegians and the Russians were both very competitive in that regard. And it led to a number of, I wouldn't say, confrontations is too strong a word, but it became a bit of a dispute as to the ability of these various nations to extract mining from Spitsbergen, which is now part of the Norwegian dominion, so to speak. But I'm not that familiar with early Russian voyages there. There were hunters though, and some very interesting stories and books written about the early Russian hunters to Spitsbergen, but not cruise people that I'm aware of.
Thank you. You've got to go, right, everybody? You've got
Yes,
to go.
thank you. Yes.
Maybe you should start a subscription for that trip. I have a sort of roundabout story. I have a friend who's doing a book on Barbara Beaudeschamps, who was an English woman, and her brother, Benjamin, both of them the illegitimate children of an Englishman who educated them all. Her brother was a captain of a whaler called the Hope. And in the 1890s, he hired a doctor. Of course, you always had to have a doctor. And the doctor hired an assistant. And he went on this cruise. And there's a photograph of this guy in the back of a little group photograph on the bow of this ship. The young man was Arthur Conan Doyle. His boss, apparently he had a completely miserable time on his one voyage to the Arctic. And so he turned to writing. But if you look at the photograph, if you being Benjamin Beaudeschamps and Conan Doyle, you will get this photograph. And off on the side is Arthur's boss, the chief surgeon, who has a deerstalk cap, a pipe, and a large nose, and he's in profile. That was Sherlock Holmes.
I know a little bit about Conan Doyle's Arctic service. He was a medical student in Scotland, and it was very common for the whalers to take medical students because they couldn't afford to pay the full cost of a surgeon, or physician. Surgeons were what they were called at the time. So oftentimes they would take medical students. Conan Doyle did voyage on the Hope. I think it wasn't a particularly noteworthy voyage in any event. And at the time, it was well before Sherlock Holmes. But he did actually write several short stories about his whaling adventures. I think one is called An Arctic Star. And there are 2 Sherlock Holmes stories that have whaling content in them. I don't remember the names now, but it's always been fascinating to me. And the one thing I had learned from his whaling excursions was that he met people and he became more outgoing, and it helped him to develop his characters later on for Sherlock Holmes, because at the time he was literally a neophyte and hadn't been anywhere. But being with these rough hands on this whaling voyage and sharing tales and swapping stories sort of helped him in his later writing career, and most noteworthy for Sherlock Holmes. So that's what I've read.
Okay, I think that wraps up what we're doing. Thank you very much, Doug. We're really glad that we could work this out, and good luck to your daughter on her match.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're